World War I, or the Great War, refers to the global conflict that began in Europe in 1914 and lasted until the formal surrender of Germany in 1919. All told, over 30 nations were involved at some point in the war. The impact was dire. Nearly 20 million deaths, including 10 million civilians. Over $300 billion in total cost during the war and in the rebuilding effort that followed. Global economic depression and high rates of unemployment, except for the United States, which wouldn't experience depression for another decade. Most countries in Europe wouldn't recover until after the Second World War. What started as an exclusively European conflict expanded to include over 30 nations from 6 different continents. It wasn't until 1917 that the U.S. was drawn into the Great War. It was at the urging of President Woodrow Wilson, who formerly ran his re-election campaign on the platform of keeping America out of the war, that Congress declared war on Germany, citing unrestricted U-boat warfare by the Germans, the sinking of the passenger vessel Lusitania, and the Zimmermann telegram as justification for said declaration. Was this declaration justified? And what efforts were made by the United States government to persuade the American people of its justification?
Welcome. Thank you for joining me this evening as we look at the First World War and the U.S. involvement. I'm your host, Chris Wood, and this is The Other Side of History.
In May of 1915, a German U-boat fired a torpedo directly into the hull of a British passenger vessel, sinking it in the Irish Sea, killing over 1,200 people, including 123 Americans. The United States was outraged. However, the Germans vowed to restrict their U-boat warfare from then on out to avoid drawing the Americans into the war. This is a tune that they would change less than 2 years later, when in the course of about 3 weeks in February of 1917, they would resume unrestricted U-boat warfare and subsequently attempt to enlist the Mexicans to fight their neighbors to the north, distracting the Americans in the process and keeping them from mobilizing a force to support the Allied forces in Europe. This correspondence between the Germans and the Mexicans began with a telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German Minister to Mexico, Heinrich von Eckert. But the telegram was intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, and the Americans were notified. In the telegram, Germany promised to return all lands lost in the Mexican-American War, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, if the Mexicans would engage the Americans in war. As you might think, this proposal did not sit well with the Americans. A busy month of February rolled into March, where another blow to the Allies' chances would occur. The February Revolution in Russia would result in a civil war that would take Russia out of World War I for good. This was a significant turn of events, because up until this point, Germany was forced to fight a war on 2 fronts, the Russians on the Eastern Front and the British and the French on the Western Front. Now, with the Russians out, the Germans could focus their efforts on the Western Front alone, a conflict that had devolved into a relative stalemate. With all of these events happening in quick succession early in 1917, on April 2nd, President Woodrow Wilson gave an impassioned speech urging Congress to declare war on Germany. Congress obliged, and by the week's end, the United States declared war on Germany.
Remember, if you will, President Wilson was elected to a second term on the platform that he kept the United States out of the war. So now the question is, how does the government persuade the American people to approve the war effort?
It would begin with the framing of the events that were at the core of Wilson's call for war, the sinking of the Lusitania, unrestricted U-boat warfare, and the Zimmermann telegram. Wilson would use these to appeal to Congress, but it would take a powerful propaganda machine to persuade the American people. That and the U.S. would also institute a draft for the first time since the American Civil War with the Selective Service Act of 1917. This propaganda machine, however, was known as the Committee on Public Information, CPI. The CPI would send out 4-minute men to deliver the mini speeches of about 4 minutes to the American people. The CPI would also create posters to encourage Americans to do the following: buy war bonds in order to fund the war effort, conserve food to assist with the feeding of the military force, the enlistment of women to perform tasks on the home front that would assist with the war effort abroad, and the enlistment of men to join the fight in Europe. The CPI excelled at their job of currying support for the American people. They excelled so much so that it made it difficult to distinguish between what is the truth of the causes for the U.S. involvement in World War I and what was propagandized. Likely the most disputed of these causes is the Zimmerman telegram. At the time of its inception, the situation was dire for the Allies. The war was waging on longer than they had hoped. The French force was nearly decimated. The British were on the verge of losing control of the seas with the German resumption of unrestricted U-boat warfare, and the Russian support on the Eastern Front was crumbling. The bottom line being that the Allies needed the U.S. to get involved post-haste.
How coincidental that they intercepted the very correspondence needed to urge the American people to join the war at the very moment when they needed them the most. It can easily be argued that the Zimmerman telegram benefited the Allies more so than it did the Germans or even the Mexicans, not to mention the outlandish assumption that Mexico would have even stood a chance at any success with the Americans, given their monumental defeat at the hands of the Americans in the Mexican-American War over a half a century before. It seems that the Mexican government thought as much, given that their almost immediate refusal to even consider the arrangement proposed by Zimmerman. Was it a last-ditch, desperate act by the Germans to salvage a lost cause? Likely not, considering that they had the Allies on the ropes with the resumption of unrestricted U-boat warfare. In fact, without the Zimmerman telegram, the Americans would have likely not acted so quickly to join the Allies, even with the Germans' broken promise of restricting U-boat warfare, as the sinking of the Lusitania was too far removed from the memories of the Americans.
The Lusitania incident was not a direct cause for the U.S. involvement, but used only as an ancillary propagandistic measure to appeal to the emotional side of the American people. It was little more than the reason that prompted the U.S. to call for the Germans to place restrictions on their U-boat warfare in the first place. But it happened nearly 2 years before. And what about the British naval blockades of the Germans in the North Sea? Does that not have the same effect as the German use of U-boats? Propaganda was also used to dehumanize the Germans. In the posters and 4-minute speeches, they were seen as brutes, killers, and savages. They were most often associated with the Huns, a barbaric tribe that raped, pillaged, and murdered, terrorizing Central Asia during the 4th through 6th centuries. According to the American view of the Germans, their lack of human quality made it easier to mobilize a liberating American force to campaign to Europe to defeat the monsters.
Additionally, could there have been ulterior motives for the U.S. to join the war effort? Perhaps President Wilson, a noted pacifist and isolationist, was secretly building the case for the U.S. involvement in World War I all along. It would certainly be detrimental to the U.S. economy if the Allies, specifically the British, were to lose the war. Also, the once burgeoning global spread of democracy would be halted, perhaps indefinitely, with a victorious endeavor by the imperialistic regimes of the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. Furthermore, the collapse of the Russian Empire might create a power vacuum that could easily be filled by any or all of the Central Power regimes, and thus signaling the death knell for the spread of democracy in Europe.
There are certainly questions surrounding the events that would draw the United States into World War I, questions that will likely go unanswered. What we do know, nevertheless, through the benefit of hindsight, is that the U.S. would join the war, and in doing so, aid the Allied forces in victory. Germany would be severely punished for their part in starting and continuing the war with the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So severe, in fact, that their destitution as a result would breed contempt and animosity amongst the German people and lay the foundation for their involvement in precipitating another world war less than 2 short decades later. So regardless of the real motivations behind the United States' involvement in the Great War, was it worth it? It should be noted that the U.S. advocated against the harsh punishment of the Germans, but President Wilson's counsel to the other Allied leaders went largely ignored, especially by the very incensed Prime Minister of France, Georges Clemenceau. Had President Wilson's recommendations been heeded, likely the German people would have recovered in due time, lacking the animosity that characterized the German state during the interwar period, and the Second World War might have been avoided altogether. Couple that proposition with the lives that were saved by ending the war when it did, and the U.S. intervention in the war might have been wholly regarded as a resounding success, despite any ulterior motives. But unfortunately, that is not what happened. And alas, as the saying goes, the rest is history.
I hope you enjoyed the program. It has been my esteemed pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm your host, Chris Wood, giving you a look at the other side of history. Take care.